The auditorium was buzzing with excitement. Families, friends, and graduates filled every corner of the large hall, voices blending into a symphony of pride and joy. The air was charged with anticipation as the final names were being called, marking the end of a long journey. Amara sat in her seat, a bright smile lighting up her face as she waited for her name to be announced. She had worked hard for this moment, late nights studying, balancing part-time jobs, and overcoming personal struggles. Today, she was no longer the shy girl from a small town. Today, she was a graduate ready to take on the world. Amara Johnson, the voice of the dean, echoed through the room. The crowd cheered, and Amara stood, smoothing her graduation gown as she made her way up the stage. Her heart pounded in her chest, and her hands trembled slightly as she shook hands with the dean and accepted her certificate. The moment felt surreal, like a dream finally coming true. As she descended the stage, her eyes caught the gaze of a man standing in the back of the hall. He wasn't clapping like everyone else. Instead, he watched her intently, his lips curved into a small, knowing smile. He stood out from the crowd, dressed in a tailored navy blue suit, his posture confident, almost regal. Amara's smile faltered for a brief second as their eyes locked. Something about him felt familiar, though she was sure she had never met him before. After the ceremony, Amara mingled with her friends and family, accepting congratulations and taking pictures. Her parents hugged her tight, their pride evident in their smiles. "Amara, you did it." Her mother beamed. "We're so proud of you." "Thanks, Mom," Amara said, feeling overwhelmed with happiness. Everything was perfect. She was about to take another photo with her friends when she noticed the man from the auditorium approaching her. He moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd with ease. When he reached her, he smiled, holding out a single red rose. "Congratulations, Amara," he said, his voice deep and smooth. Amara raised an eyebrow, a teasing smile tugging at her lips. "A rose? How klitsch." The man chuckled softly, his eyes sparkling with amusement. "Klitsch? Maybe. But roses carry meaning, and I think this one suits you perfectly." Amara took the rose, her fingers brushing against the velvety petals. "And what meaning does this rose carry?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. The man's smile widened. "Beauty, strength, and a touch of mystery." Amara couldn't help but laugh. "And who are you, exactly? Should I know you?" The man extended his hand. "David Wilson. I run a company downtown and am here as a guest of one of the graduates." Amara hesitated for a moment before shaking his hand. "Amara Johnson. Though I suppose you already knew that." "I do," David said, his gaze lingering on her. "But I'd like to know more about you." Amara felt her cheeks warm under his intense gaze. There was something about David that made her feel both intrigued and unsettled. But before she could respond, her friends called her over for more pictures, pulling her away from the conversation. As the day went on, Amara found herself thinking about David. The way he looked at her, the smoothness of his voice, and of course, the mysterious rose. There was something captivating about him, something that made her want to know more. Weeks passed, and Amara's life moved on after graduation. She applied for jobs, went to interviews, and continued to celebrate her achievements with friends. But no matter how busy she was, she couldn't stop thinking about David. It wasn't long before she ran into him again. This time, it was at her first job interview. To her surprise, David was the CEO of the company she had applied to, Wilson Enterprises. She didn't know whether to be flattered or concerned when he greeted her with a familiar smile and another red rose. "You're here for the interview, I assume?" he asked, handing her the rose. Amara stared at him, her heart racing. "You're the CEO?" David shrugged, his smile never wavering. "Surprised?" "A little," Amara admitted. "But I suppose I should have guessed. You seem like someone who's in charge." "I take that as a compliment," David said, gesturing for her to follow him. "Let's get started with the interview." The interview was brief but intense. David's questions were direct, testing not just her skills, but her mindset. By the end of it, Amara was sure she hadn't impressed him. But to her surprise, David called her back 2 days later with a job offer. "I see potential in you, Amara," he said over the phone. "I think we could do great things together." Amara hesitated. "Together? You mean professionally, right?" David's laugh was deep and genuine. "Of course. But who knows? Maybe it could be more." Their professional relationship quickly grew into something personal. David was everything Amara had ever wanted in a partner: caring, supportive, and attentive. Every morning, a single rose appeared at her doorstep, a silent reminder of his devotion. David took her on vacations to exotic locations, showered her with gifts, and made her feel like the most important person in the world. Their dates were lavish, their dinners filled with laughter, and their nights were passionate. To everyone around them, Amara was living the dream. Her friends envied her, and her colleagues admired her. David was the perfect boyfriend, and their relationship seemed like a fairy tale. But despite all the happiness, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that there was something David wasn't telling her. The roses, though beautiful, began to feel ominous. She never questioned them, not wanting to ruin the magic, but deep down, she wondered why he chose to send them every single day. Amara's life seemed picture-perfect, but behind the scenes, things were beginning to unravel. She had been feeling unwell for weeks: dizziness, nausea, and fatigue. At first, she brushed it off as stress from work, but as the symptoms worsened, she couldn't ignore them any longer. One evening, as she prepared dinner in their beautiful home, the familiar weakness washed over her. Her hands trembled as she chopped vegetables, and her vision blurred. She tried to steady herself, but her legs gave out beneath her. With a sharp gasp, Amara collapsed to the ground, the sound of the knife clattering to the floor echoing in her ears. Her world spun, and darkness consumed her. Hours later, the maid found her unconscious on the kitchen floor. Panic ensued as the ambulance was called, and Amara was rushed to the hospital. David arrived not long after, his face pale with worry. When he reached her room, he found her lying still, her once vibrant face now pale and weak. Doctors hovered around her, their voices low and serious. "Is she going to be okay?" David asked, his voice shaking. The doctor, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, shook his head. "We're not sure. Her condition is critical. We're running tests, but we need to monitor her closely." David's heart shattered as he sank into a chair by her bedside, his hands trembling as he covered his face. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he cried for the woman he had once loved so deeply, the woman he had built a life with. Days turned into weeks, and Amara's condition worsened. The doctors were baffled, unable to find the cause of her illness. Each day, David sat by her side, holding her hand, watching as the life slowly drained from her body. But even in the face of death, the roses never stopped. Each morning, a new rose arrived in her hospital room, its red petals vibrant and full of life. Amara smiled weakly every time she saw it, but a part of her was beginning to wonder why they never stopped. "David," she whispered one evening, her voice barely audible. Why do you still bring the roses?" David looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Because I love you, Amara. And I always will." But there was something in his voice that made Amara uneasy, something that felt wrong. "David, what aren't you telling me?" she asked, her voice trembling. David remained silent for a long moment, his eyes distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and haunting. "There's something you need to know, Amara. Something I've kept hidden from you for a long time." Amara's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at him, fear creeping into her veins. "What is it?" she whispered. David stood up, pacing the room, his hands running through his hair. "It's about my brother Henry." Amara's blood ran cold at the mention of Henry's name. She hadn't thought about him in years, but now the memories came flooding back. Henry had been sweet, gentle, almost too kind. They had dated briefly in college, but Amara, ambitious and focused on her future, had grown bored of him. He wasn't the type of man who could give her the life she dreamed of. So, she had moved on coldly, cruelly, as if he were just another chapter in her story that needed to be closed. She remembered the day she ended things with him. His tear-streaked face, his trembling hands as he begged her to reconsider. But she had been heartless, telling him she had met someone else, someone better. She wanted more, and Henry just wasn't enough. But why was David bringing him up now, after all these years? Henry? Amara whispered, her voice barely audible. What about him? David turned to face her, his expression dark, the warmth that once filled his eyes now replaced with something far more sinister. He loved you, David said slowly, his voice thick with emotion. More than anything in this world. He thought you were the one for him. You were his everything, Amara. Amara's chest tightened. She knew this. Henry had been infatuated with her, always bending over backward to please her, but she had never truly reciprocated his feelings. To her, he was just there. David continued, his tone growing colder. But you broke him. You toyed with his heart and then tossed him aside like he meant nothing to you. Amara's throat tightened. She tried to speak, but no words came out. You betrayed him, Amara. He couldn't take the pain of your betrayal. And when you left him for someone else, David's voice cracked, and he closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady himself. He took his own life. Amara's heart stopped. The room spun around her as she tried to process his words. No, that's not true, she stammered, shaking her head. I didn't mean for that to happen. David's eyes snapped open, filled with anger. You didn't know because you didn't care, Amara. You never cared about anyone but yourself. Tears welled in Amara's eyes as the weight of his words pressed down on her. David, please, I didn't know he felt that way. I didn't think you didn't think? David interrupted, his voice rising. You didn't think because it was always about you. You wanted the best, the richest, the man who could spoil you, and Henry wasn't that. He wasn't enough for you. Amara sobbed, guilt crashing over her like a wave. I'm so sorry. David stood still for a moment, watching her crumble before him. His face softened, but only slightly. Sorry won't bring him back, he whispered. Amara wiped her tears, her hands trembling. Why are you telling me this now? David turned his back to her, his gaze fixed on the window. Because I need you to understand, Amara. I need you to understand why I did what I did. Her breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. David turned back to her, his eyes cold as ice. I've been poisoning you, Amara. Slowly, every day, for the past 2 years, with every single rose I gave you. Amara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as the room seemed to close in around her. No, you're lying. You love me. David's expression didn't change. I loved you once. But then I remembered what you did to my brother, and I knew I couldn't let you live a happy life, not after what you did. I wanted you to feel what Henry felt. Helpless. Dying slowly, without knowing why. Amara's mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. The dizziness, the nausea, the weakness, it all made sense now. She had been dying, slowly, from the inside out, and the man she loved had been the one killing her. She looked at him, horror filling her eyes. How could you do this to me? David's face remained calm, emotionless. I wanted justice, Amara. For Henry. For my brother, who you destroyed. Amara sobbed, her body shaking. Please, David, I didn't mean to hurt him. I didn't know. David knelt beside her bed, his voice softening for the first time. I know you didn't, Amara. But that doesn't change what happened. My brother is gone because of you. She looked into his eyes, pleading. Can't you forgive me? Can't you stop this? It's not too late, David. Please. David stared at her, his expression unreadable. I forgave you long ago, Amara, he said quietly. But that doesn't mean I could let you live. Her heart shattered as the reality of her situation sank in. There was no escape, no hope for redemption. David had planned this all along, and now there was nothing left but the end. David, she whispered, her voice weak and broken. He stood up, his face a mask of calm once again. Rest now, Amara. It won't be long. As he turned to leave the room, Amara reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the rose on her bedside table. The petals were soft, but the thorns bit into her skin, drawing blood. The door clicked shut behind David, and Amara was left alone, her world crumbling around her. The hospital room was quiet, save for the soft beeping of the machines monitoring Amara's fading heartbeat. Days passed, and her condition worsened. The doctors had no explanation for her rapid decline, and no treatment seemed to help. David visited her every day, sitting by her bedside, holding her hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. He never spoke of Henry again, and Amara was too weak to bring it up. Each day, a new rose appeared in her room, its vibrant red petals mocking her as her life slipped away. One evening, as the sun set outside her window, Amara stirred, her eyes fluttering open. She was weak, barely able to move, but she managed to turn her head slightly to see David sitting beside her. "David," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He looked at her, his expression soft but distant. "I'm here." Amara's breath was shallow, her chest rising and falling with difficulty. "The roses, they never stopped." David nodded. "They never will." Tears welled in her eyes. "Why?" David leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Because they remind me of you, Amara. Strong, beautiful, but with thorns." She closed her eyes, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I loved you, I know," David whispered. "And I loved you too. But love can turn into something else when it's poisoned by pain." Amara's breathing slowed, her body growing heavier with each passing moment. She knew her time was running out. With one final, weak breath, she whispered, "I'm sorry." David pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, his lips lingering for a moment before he pulled away. "I know," he said quietly. As the last petal of her life fell, David stood and walked to the window, staring out into the darkness. The room was silent now, save for the soft rustle of petals as the final rose lay in her hand, its thorns digging deep into her fragile skin. The funeral was small, attended only by close friends and family. Amara had been a bright light in their lives, and now that light was extinguished. David stood at the back of the crowd, his face emotionless as he watched her casket being lowered into the ground. He held a single red rose in his hand, the same kind he had given her every day for the past 2 years. As the priest said the final words, David stepped forward, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He knelt beside her grave, placing the rose gently on top of the casket. The thorns pricked his fingers, but he didn't flinch. As he stood up, he whispered softly, "Rest in peace, Amara." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving the rose behind, a symbol of love, betrayal, and vengeance. Weeks passed after the funeral, and life moved on. David returned to his work, his mind clear and focused. The weight he had carried for so long was finally lifted. His brother's memory was avenged, and the woman who had destroyed him was gone. But despite his success, there was an emptiness inside him that couldn't be filled. The roses he had once sent with such purpose now sat untouched in his office. The vibrant red petals, once a symbol of his plan, now felt hollow. One evening, as David sat at his desk, staring at the rose in front of him, a knock echoed through his office. "Come in," he called, his voice tired. The door creaked open, and a familiar figure stepped inside. David's breath hitched as he looked up and saw her Amara's mother, Mrs. Ifeoma. She was a tall, regal woman with streaks of silver in her hair and a face lined with the weight of years. Her eyes, however, were sharp, filled with a quiet intensity that unnerved David. "Mrs. Ifeoma," David said, standing quickly, his heart pounding in his chest. "I didn't expect." "You didn't expect me," she interrupted, her voice steady but firm. "I know, but here I am." David cleared his throat, unsure of how to proceed. He had managed to avoid most of Amara's family after her death, especially her mother, whose penetrating gaze always made him feel exposed. "What brings you here?" he asked, gesturing toward a chair, but Mrs. Ifeoma remained standing. "I came to talk about my daughter," she said, her voice cold. David swallowed hard, the guilt and unease swirling inside him. "I'm sorry for your loss," he managed, the words sticking in his throat. Mrs. Ifeoma stared at him, her eyes never leaving his. "Are you?" David felt the weight of her gaze pressing down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt truly vulnerable. "Of course I am. I loved Amara." Her lips twisted into a bitter smile. Loved her? Or loved the idea of her? David frowned, taken aback by the question. "I don't understand." "I don't think you do," she replied, stepping closer. "My daughter was many things: ambitious, stubborn, sometimes reckless. But she didn't deserve what happened to her. And I can't help but feel that you know more than you're saying, David." David's pulse quickened. "What are you implying?" Mrs. Ifeoma's eyes narrowed. "Amara's death wasn't natural. You know that as well as I do. The doctors couldn't explain why she fell ill so suddenly, why she wasted away without any known disease." David opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He had been so careful, so meticulous in his plan. How could she possibly know? "I don't have proof," Mrs. Ifeoma continued, her voice low but full of conviction. "But a mother knows when something isn't right. And I know you, David. You're not the man you pretend to be." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing. He had planned every detail perfectly: the slow poisoning, the roses, the subtle symptoms that no one would question. But now, standing before Amara's mother, he felt exposed, as if she could see right through him. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "I loved Amara. I did everything I could to save her." Mrs. Ifeoma took another step closer, her gaze never wavering. "If you truly loved her, then you would have told her the truth. You would have let her live." David's breath caught in his throat. The truth. The word echoed in his mind, taunting him. He had justified his actions, convinced himself that it was justice for Henry, but now, facing the weight of a mother's grief, the certainty he had clung to began to crumble. "She hurt my brother," David said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "She destroyed him." Mrs. Ifeoma's expression softened, just for a moment. "Henry was a good man. I knew him. He loved Amara deeply. But people make mistakes, David. That's part of being human." David's eyes flickered with pain. She didn't just make a mistake. She shattered his heart and left him to die. "I couldn't just let that go." Mrs. Ifeoma sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. "And now you've shattered hers in return. But what has it brought you? Peace? Satisfaction?" David's jaw tightened as he looked away. No. He had expected to feel relief, closure, but instead, there was only emptiness, a hollow void where his vengeance had once burned bright. "I did what I had to do," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Mrs. Ifeoma shook her head slowly. "No, David. You did what your pain drove you to do. But pain is a dangerous guide. It blinds us to the truth." David's shoulders slumped, the weight of her words sinking in. The truth. The reality he had been avoiding since the moment Amara had taken her last breath. He had become the very thing he despised, a destroyer of lives, just like her. "I don't expect you to confess," Mrs. Ifeoma said, her voice gentler now. "But I want you to know that I see you. And one day, you'll have to face the consequences of what you've done." With that, she turned and walked toward the door, her presence leaving a chill in the room. David stood there, frozen, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. As the door closed behind her, he collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands. For the first time since he had set his plan into motion, David felt something he hadn't anticipated. Regret. Weeks passed, and David's life began to unravel. He couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Ifeoma's eyes, the quiet accusation that lingered in her words. His work suffered, his sleep was restless, and the roses that once filled his office with purpose now felt like a mockery of everything he had lost. One night, as David sat alone in his office, a single rose lying on his desk, he heard a knock at the door. He didn't bother to look up, his eyes fixed on the crimson petals before him. "Come in," he muttered, his voice hollow. The door opened, and a familiar voice filled the room. "David." He looked up, his heart skipping a beat. Standing in the doorway was Henry, or rather, the memory of him. Henry's face was as David remembered, kind, gentle, but now with a sadness that hadn't been there before. "You did it," Henry said softly, stepping forward. "You got your revenge." David's breath caught in his throat. "Henry the First, I'm sorry." Henry shook his head. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, David. I never wanted this for you. Or for her." David's chest tightened as he looked at the apparition of his brother, guilt clawing at his insides. "She hurt you, Henry. She destroyed you." Henry's eyes softened. "She hurt me, yes. But people hurt each other all the time, David. That doesn't mean they deserve to die for it." David looked down at the rose in his hand, his vision blurring with tears. "I thought I was doing this for you." Henry stepped closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You were doing it for yourself. For your pain, not mine." The truth of Henry's words hit David like a wave, crashing over him with relentless force. He had justified his actions, told himself that he was avenging his brother, but in reality, he had been feeding his own darkness. "I'm sorry," David choked, his tears falling freely now. "I'm so sorry." Henry smiled sadly. "It's too late for apologies, David. But maybe it's not too late for redemption." David looked up, his eyes filled with desperation. How do I make this right?" Henry's figure began to fade, his voice echoing in the room. "You'll have to find that answer yourself, little brother. But remember, love doesn't have to end in pain." As Henry disappeared, the rose in David's hand slipped from his grasp, falling to the floor with a soft thud. David sat there, alone in the darkness, the weight of his choices pressing down on him. And for the first time in his life, he realized that vengeance had brought him nothing but an empty heart and a trail of broken lives. The trail of broken lives stretched far beyond Amara and Henry. It included everyone who had once looked up to David, who had trusted him, admired him. His friends, his colleagues, and even the household staff who saw him as a generous employer. All of them had witnessed a slow change in him, but none had known the reason behind it, the darkness festering inside him. Days turned into weeks, and David became a shadow of himself. He stopped going to work, shut off all communication, and rarely left the house. His once pristine home, where roses had always bloomed with beauty, now felt like a mausoleum, a place haunted by memories of the past. David wandered aimlessly through the house one morning, his mind a fog of guilt and regret. As he passed the living room, his eyes fell on a picture of Amara, smiling brightly on their trip to Paris. She looked so full of life then, her eyes sparkling with joy, completely unaware of the man who had promised her forever while plotting her demise. He couldn't look at her picture for long, the weight of what had done was too heavy. He had spent years meticulously planning his revenge, but now it all seemed meaningless. Henry's words echoed in his mind, love doesn't have to end in pain. How had he allowed it to get this far? David's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing. He hesitated before picking it up. It was a text message from his lawyer. "The investigation into Amara's death is intensifying. Police have been asking more questions. We need to meet soon." David's heart raced. He had thought Head covered his tracks, but it seemed that suspicion was starting to grow. Mrs. Ifeoma must have been stirring things up, refusing to let Amara's death be written off as a mystery. Could it be possible that the truth was closing in on him? David met with his lawyer the next day, his anxiety building with every second. The two sat in a small, windowless office, the walls closing in around them. His lawyer, a no-nonsense man named Mr. Davies, was flipping through a stack of documents, his brow furrowed. "David, we have a problem," Mr. Davies began, his tone grave. "The police aren't just investigating the cause of Amara's death anymore. They're looking into her medical records, financial transactions, and they've started questioning the household staff." David's stomach twisted into knots. What are they asking? They're trying to piece together why a healthy young woman would suddenly fall ill. And from what I've gathered, the maid who found her is feeling uneasy about the whole situation. She mentioned to the investigators that you've been acting strange since Amara's passing. David's mind raced. He had always been careful, never leaving any physical trace of the poison he had hidden in the roses. But paranoia began to set in. Was there something he'd missed? Something that could link him to her death? Should I be worried? David asked, his voice low. Mr. Davies looked him in the eye, his expression serious. Not yet. But you need to be prepared. If they dig too deep, they might find something. You need to act like you have nothing to hide. David nodded, but the fear was gnawing at him from the inside. He had thought he could live with the consequences of his actions, but now that the law was closing in on him, he wasn't so sure. Every day felt like a countdown to the inevitable the truth coming to light. One evening, David sat in the dim light of his study, staring at the final rose he had ever given to Amara. It lay in front of him on the desk, its petals starting to wilt, much like his life. He had been drinking heavily, the whiskey burning a hole in his chest, when there was a knock at the door. David, came a voice from outside. It was Mrs. Ifeoma again. David hesitated, his grip tightening around the glass in his hand. He didn't want to see her, didn't want to face the woman whose daughter he had murdered. But he knew he couldn't avoid her forever. He opened the door, and there she stood, her expression unreadable. May I come in? She asked quietly. David stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She walked into the study, her eyes scanning the room before landing on the rose on his desk. You never stopped sending them, did you? She asked, her voice soft. David looked down at the rose, his chest tightening with guilt. No, I didn't. Mrs. Ifeoma walked over to the desk, picking up the rose gently, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. You know, Amara used to tell me about the roses you sent her every day. She loved them. She thought it was the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for her. David swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. But now I see, Mrs. Ifeoma continued, her voice taking on a hard edge, they were never about love. They were about control. About power. About revenge. David's throat tightened as the words hit him like a blow. I wanted justice for Henry. Mrs. Ifeoma's eyes burned with a mix of anger and sorrow. And what about Amara's justice, David? Who will give her that? David opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. He had no defense, no justification that could undo the damage he had caused. I hope you find peace, Mrs. Ifeoma said quietly, placing the rose back on the desk. But I don't think you ever will. With that, she turned and left, leaving David alone with his thoughts once again. The days that followed were a blur for David. He no longer cared about the investigation, about what the police might find. The only thing he could focus on was the crushing guilt that weighed on him, a burden he could no longer carry. One night, as he sat in the same chair where he had once plotted Amara's death, he made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. If he couldn't find redemption, then he would accept his ruin. David picked up his phone, his hands trembling as he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Detective Thomas, came the gruff voice on the other end. David swallowed hard, his heart racing. This is David Nwosu. I need to talk to you about Amara's death. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and David could hear the detective's breathing, slow and steady. I'll be at your place in 30 minutes, Detective Thomas said, and then the line went dead. David hung up the phone, his chest heaving with a mixture of fear and relief. This was it. The end of his carefully constructed lie, the moment when he would finally face the consequences of his actions. He didn't know what the future held, whether he would be redeemed or ruined. But for the first time in years, David felt something that had eluded him for so long. And as he waited for the detective to arrive, he realized that no matter what happened next, the roses would finally